A man brought his elderly father to a job interview, and what the CEO did next shocked everyone. From the very first step into that office, whispers followed him. Some judged, some laughed, but no one could predict how the story would unfold. Before we dive in, let me ask you, where are you watching from? Drop it down in the comments. I'd love to see just how far the story travels. Now let's begin. On a bright Monday morning, a young man named Ethan Cole stepped through the glass doors of one of the most prestigious companies in the city. He was 28 years old, confident on the outside, but with a storm of nerves twisting in his chest. His hair, neatly combed, caught the glow of the sunlight pouring through the lobby windows. His eyes, hazel, warm yet restless, scanned the grandeur around him. But what made people stop and stare wasn't Ethan himself. It was a frail figure walking just a step behind him. His father, Richard Cole, a man with silver hair, weathered lines etched across his face, and a frame weakened by age, yet carrying an unmistakable air of quiet dignity. And in that moment, the bustling lobby of executives, assistants, and applicants seemed to fall into a hush. Eyes followed them, some puzzled, some amused, and some already quietly judging. Who brings their elderly father to a job interview? Ethan felt the weight of their whispers, the sting of those smirks, but he didn't falter. With every step, he kept close to the man who had raised him single-handedly, the man who had taught him the meaning of sacrifice and the strength of honor. This wasn't just an interview. For Ethan, it was a chance to prove that everything his father had given up was worth it. But little did he know, the person waiting on the top floor, CEO Isabella Hart, was about to see something no resume could ever show. And what she decided in that room would shock everyone. Ethan Cole wasn't born into privilege. He grew up in a small, modest home on the edge of town, where every creak of the wooden floor carried the sound of sacrifice. His father, Richard, had once been strong, a man with calloused hands from years of labor, a man who never hesitated to work 2, sometimes 3 jobs, just keep food on the table and a roof overhead. But life has a way of taking its toll. When Ethan was only 10 years old, his mother passed away suddenly. From that day on, it was just Richard and his boy, facing the world together. Richard never remarried. He poured everything, every ounce of his strength, every quiet hope he had, into raising Ethan. There were nights when Richard came home long after the sun had set, his shoulders heavy, his body aching. Yet he still found the energy to ask his son about his day, to help with homework, or simply sit with him in silence, because sometimes that was all a child needed. And Ethan watched. He noticed. Even as a boy, he saw the sacrifices. He saw the worn shoes his father never replaced so Ethan could have new ones for school. He saw the skipped meals, hidden behind a gentle smile, just so he would never go hungry. Those moments, they shaped him. Ethan grew into a young man who carried himself with quiet determination. Strong, well-built from years of discipline, yet never boastful. Charming, yes, but not because of his looks. His true charm was in the way he listened, the way he spoke with respect, the way he treated people not as obstacles or stepping stones, but as human beings worthy of dignity. And through all of it, Richard stood by him. Even now, frail in body but not in spirit, he remained Ethan's anchor. His walking stick was steadied aside, but his pride in his son, that stood taller than any skyscraper they now entered. To the world, Richard might look like just an old man being escorted to an interview he didn't belong in. But to Ethan, Richard was the reason he belonged anywhere at all. Because every step he took in that grand lobby, every ambition he carried was built on the back of a father who never once gave up on him. And though Ethan tried to hide it behind steady breaths, he knew the truth. He wasn't walking into this interview alone. He was carrying his father's legacy with him. The building that housed the company was more than just an office. It was a symbol. Its glass walls stretched toward the sky, reflecting the sun like a beacon of wealth, success, and prestige. Inside, the air was crisp and deliberate. Polished floors, marble counters, sleek furniture lined with precision. Every detail seemed to whisper the same thing. Only the best belonged here. Ethan felt the weight of that message with every step. He knew the reputation of this place. People fought for years just to get an interview. Some never even made it past the first round. And at the top of it all was Isabella Hart. She was a name everyone in the industry knew. A woman who had risen faster than most thought possible, earning her position not through family connections or luck, but through relentless intelligence, sharp instincts, and elegance that demanded respect the moment she walked into a room. Isabella was in her early 30s, yet she commanded the kind of authority most CEOs twice her age still struggled to hold. With long blonde hair that fell effortlessly past her shoulders, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see far deeper than most people were comfortable with, she was striking. Beautiful, yes, but there was something more. A presence. The kind of presence that made others straighten their backs, choose their words carefully, and hope to earn her approval. But behind that professional armor, there was warmth, a subtle grace in the way she greeted people, a genuine curiosity when she listened. She wasn't cold, like so many others in her position. She was human, and yet not easily impressed. Isabella's standards were legendary. Candidates came into her office armed with flawless resumes, polished answers, and carefully rehearsed stories. Most walked out humbled, some even broken. She didn't settle for good on paper. She was searching for something more. And today, Ethan Cole was about to walk into her world. For him, the stakes were higher than most could imagine. This wasn't just a job. This was an opportunity to lift a weight that had rested on his father's shoulders for decades, to prove that the sacrifices Richard made hadn't been in vain. Still, a question lingered in the air like a shadow over the lobby. How would Isabella react to the sight of a young man bringing his elderly father into one of the most serious interviews of his career? Would she see it as weakness, as unprofessional, as proof that Ethan didn't belong in such a place? Or would she see something no one else could? As the elevator doors closed, carrying Ethan and Richard upward toward the top floor, silence filled the narrow space. Ethan adjusted his tie with a steady hand, but inside his heart raced. Richard placed a trembling hand on his son's arm, not to hold him back, but to remind him he wasn't alone. And somewhere in her office, Isabella Hart prepared for another interview, unaware that this one would be unlike any she had ever conducted before. The elevator doors slid open with a quiet chime, and Ethan stepped out, his father just a half step behind him. The top floor looked different, more refined, more intimidating. The air was cooler here, sharper somehow, as if even the oxygen reminded you to be on your best behavior. Rows of sleek chairs lined the corridor outside the executive offices, filled with candidates waiting their turn. Perfectly pressed suits, immaculate hairstyles, portfolios clutched tightly in eager hands. And then silence broke. Not the kind that comes naturally. The kind that comes when people notice something unusual. Ethan felt it immediately. The shift, the subtle pause in movement, the glances darting in his direction. Whispers began, low at first, then just loud enough to cut through the air like tiny blades. Is that his father? Why would someone bring an old man here? That's ridiculous. This isn't a family outing. A soft laugh escaped from one corner. Another candidate leaned in close to whisper behind a raised hand. A few didn't even bother to hide their smirks. Ethan's chest tightened. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on steady breaths, but the weight of their judgment pressed down on him. His jaw tense, his palms grew damp. He glanced at his father, worried Richard might notice the ridicule, worried he might feel like a burden. But Richard only sat quietly, his hands resting on his cane, eyes steady calm. There was no shame in his expression, only quiet pride and patience. Still, the whispers continued. This is a job interview, not a nursing home. He'll never get hired like that. Unprofessional, desperate. Each word stung, sharper than the last. Ethan wanted to speak up, to defend his father, to silence the mockery, but he swallowed the urge. This wasn't the time for outbursts. Instead, he adjusted his shoulders, straightened his tie, and forced his gaze forward. He reminded himself why he was here. Not for their approval, not for their shallow opinions, but for the man sitting beside him, the man who had given everything so that Ethan could stand in this very place. Still, deep down, a flicker of doubt began to grow. What if they were right? What if Isabella Hart saw the same thing these people saw? What if bringing his father here cost him everything? The door at the end of the hall opened. A woman in a crisp suit called out, "Ethan Cole, the CEO will see you now." The whispers hushed, but the smirks remained. Some leaned back in their seats, shaking their heads as if they already knew how this story would end. Ethan rose slowly, then turned to help his father to his feet. With gentle care, he adjusted Richard's jacket, made sure his hand was steady on the cane, and offered his arm for support. The room watched in silence, some amused, some confused. But Isabella Hart was waiting, and she would see what none of them could. Ethan stepped into the CEO's office, his father steady at his side. The room was vast, polished wood, tall windows spilling light across the floor, a desk so immaculate it seemed untouched by human hands. Yet the real presence was in the decor. It was in the woman seated behind the desk, Isabella Hart. Her blue eyes lifted from the folder before her, landing on Ethan first, then drifting to the older man at his side. For a heartbeat, silence filled the air. Ethan's chest tightened. His mind raced. She's judging me. She thinks this is unprofessional. She thinks I'm weak. He shifted slightly. His voice caught in his throat, unsure whether to explain why his father was here. The weight of all those whispers from the waiting area still echoed inside him. But Isabella didn't frown. She didn't raise an eyebrow. She simply observed. And in that quiet observation, she noticed details others had missed. The way Ethan guided his father to the chair beside him. Not hurriedly, not carelessly, but with gentle precision, making sure Richard's hand found the armrest before he sat. The way Ethan poured a glass of water for his father before taking one for himself. The way his posture, though nervous, shifted instantly at the smallest sign of his father's discomfort. Respect, patience, loyalty, qualities you can't fake. Qualities that don't show up on a resume. And in that moment, Isabella felt something stir. A memory. Her own father. A man who had once stood proudly beside her, encouraging her every step of the way. He had been her foundation, her anchor. But life, cruel and unforgiving, had taken him far too soon. She had never had the chance to truly thank him. Her eyes softened. What she saw in front of her wasn't unprofessional. It wasn't weakness. It was devotion. The kind of devotion she missed more than anything. She leaned back slightly, folding her hands on the desk. Her voice, warm yet steady, broke the silence. "Ethan," she said, "why don't you tell me about yourself? Not what's on the resume. Tell me your story." Ethan blinked, startled. He had expected the sharp, business-like interrogation Isabella was known for. He had prepared for technical questions, for scrutiny, for a fight to prove himself. But this was different. He hesitated, searching for words. "Well, But Isabella held up a hand gently, her gaze shifting once again to Richard. "And you," she added softly, addressing the old man. "You've raised him. You must have stories worth hearing, too." The air in the room shifted. The judgment Ethan had feared was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was curiosity and something far deeper. The interview that had begun as a test of skill was turning into something far more profound. And Ethan realized this wasn't about credentials anymore. This was about values, about character, about the heart behind the man. For the first time since stepping into the building, Ethan's pulse began to slow. A flicker of hope rose in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was the kind of moment where everything could change. And it was all because Isabella Hart had chosen to see what others refused to. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Ethan sat forward, trying to find the words Isabella had asked for. His resume was filled with accomplishments. But suddenly, none of them felt like the right answer. Before he could speak, a soft, trembling voice broke the stillness. It was Richard. His hands rested on the top of his cane. Knuckles pale, voice unsteady but clear enough to fill the space. "If I may," he said, his eyes meeting Isabella's, "I'd like to tell you something about my son." Ethan's head turned sharply. "Dad," he whispered, embarrassed, worried. But Richard simply raised a hand, as if to say, "Let me do this." Isabella leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable, but her attention absolute. Richard took a slow breath. Ethan has been carrying the weight of responsibility since he was just a boy. When his mother passed, he was only 10. I thought it would break him losing her so young, but instead, he tried to take care of me. Imagine that, a child comforting his father. His voice cracked, but he pressed on, determined. He grew up watching me work too, 3 jobs at a time. He knew we didn't have much. And instead of complaining, instead of asking for more, he learned to give, to sacrifice. I'd come home bone-tired, barely able to stand. He'd already have dinner on the table, homework finished, the house in order. No one told him to do it. He just did. Richard paused, his eyes glistening. Ethan lowered his gaze, fighting the knot tightening in his throat. "My son," Richard continued, "is the kind of man who refuses to give up no matter how hard life gets. He never once let me feel like I had failed him. In fact, he made me believe I'd done something right. Because somehow, through all the hardships, he grew into this." Richard gestured with a trembling hand toward Ethan. "This man you see before you today. Honest, loyal, hardworking, and above all respectful." The room was still. Even the hum of the city outside felt muted, as if the world itself had paused to listen. Ethan's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. He wanted to interrupt, to tell his father he didn't have to say any of this. But deep down, he knew Richard needed to. And Isabella, her eyes shimmered. She wasn't just hearing words. She was feeling them. Every syllable carried the weight of love, sacrifice, and truth. Richard leaned back slightly, his energy waning, but his spirit unbroken. If you're looking for someone who understands responsibility, who knows what it means to fight for something bigger than himself, then you don't need to look at his resume. You just need to look at the way he treats me. That will tell you everything. His words lingered, heavy and raw. The whispers of doubt, the smirks, the judgment Ethan had endured outside were gone, replaced now by a silence that demanded respect. And in that silence, something unspoken passed between Isabella and Ethan. A connection, a recognition. She understood now this was no ordinary candidate and no ordinary man. This was someone forged in fire, shaped by love, and strengthened by loyalty. And nothing, no resume, no polished interview answer, could compare to that. For a long moment, the room was still. Richard's word hung in the air like a sacred truth, too heavy and too tender to be brushed aside. Ethan sat frozen, his eyes lowered, his throat tight. He hadn't expected his father to speak, let alone to bare his heart like that in front of a stranger. And yet every word had been true. Across the desk, Isabella Hart remained silent. Her blue eyes shimmered. The usual composure she wore like armor slowly beginning crack. She inhaled deeply, her voice soft when she finally spoke. "You know," she said, her gaze shifting briefly toward the window, "my father was the same way. Always steady. Always there. He taught me everything I know about integrity, about leadership. But he passed before I ever got the chance to tell him how much he meant to me." Her voice faltered. She cleared her throat, but the emotion was there, woven into every syllable. When her eyes returned to Ethan and Richard, they weren't the sharp, assessing eyes of CEO. They were the eyes of a daughter remembering her father and realizing the depth of what she had lost. Ethan lifted his head slowly, his hazel eyes meeting hers. For the first time, he saw her not as an intimidating executive, but as a person, someone who understood pain, someone who knew the weight of family. And in that unspoken connection, the walls between them began to fall. Isabella leaned forward, folding her hands. The way you honor your father, Ethan, the patience, the respect, it tells me more about your character than any resume ever could. Skills can be taught. Loyalty, compassion, they cannot. Ethan swallowed hard, words caught in his throat. His instinct was to thank her, but gratitude felt too small, too shallow for this moment. Instead, he simply nodded, his chest heavy with emotion. Richard, his eyes moist, gave his son a faint smile, the kind only a father could give. Proud, quiet, unshakable. For a moment, time seemed to stop. There were no whispering doubters, no polished suits waiting outside, no hierarchy of CEO and candidate, just three people, bound together by something far greater than ambition or success. Respect, empathy, family. Isabella exhaled slowly, her voice steady but tender. I see now, Ethan. I see the man you are, and I see the man who helped you become him. Her words struck deeper than any formal praise. They weren't professional approval. They were human recognition. Ethan sat back slightly, his father's hand still resting near his, and for the first time since he had stepped into the building, he felt peace. Not because the outcome was certain, but because he had been truly seen. And in Isabella's eyes, there was something else. Not just respect, not just empathy, but the faint spark of connection. Something rare, something powerful, something that could never be planned or forced. The interview, once about qualifications, had transformed into something profoundly different. It had become a conversation of the heart. And from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The silence in the room lingered for a few precious seconds more, heavy but not uncomfortable. It was a kind of silence that follows truth. When there's nothing left to prove, nothing left to hide, Isabella finally leaned back in her chair, her expression softer than anyone had ever seen it. She tapped her pen once against the desk, as though finalizing an internal decision, then set it down with quiet finality. Her words came gently, but with undeniable weight. Ethan, the position is yours. For a moment, Ethan thought he hadn't heard her correctly. His eyes flicked to his father, then back to her. His voice cracked slightly. Are you sure? Isabella smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both strength and empathy. Yes, I've interviewed dozens of candidates for this role. Many were qualified. Some were impressive. But you, she paused, letting her words settle. You've shown me something they couldn't. Character, integrity, the kind of values that can't be taught in a classroom or polished onto a resume. This company doesn't just need talent, Ethan. It needs people like you. Ethan's chest swelled, the tightness he had carried since stepping into the building releasing in a rush of relief. His father's hand rested on his arm, trembling slightly, but filled with pride. Richard whispered softly, just loud enough for him to hear, "You did it, son." But Ethan shook his head gently and smiled. "No, Dad, we did." For the first time that day, the anxiety melted from his face. And for Richard, the man who had spent years sacrificing quietly in the background, it was a moment of vindication. All the long nights, all the labor, all the dreams he had placed into his boy's hands. It was all worth it. Outside the office, the same people who had whispered and mocked earlier noticed when Ethan and Richard emerged together. This time, there were no laughs, no smirks, only stunned silence. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Others avoided eye contact because they knew, against all odds, against every unkind whisper, Ethan had walked into that room and earned something far greater than a job. He had earned respect. Isabella followed them to the door, watching the pair as they stepped into the hallway. For a brief second, her gaze lingered on Ethan. On the way, he steadied his father, on the quiet strength in his stride. And though she said nothing, her eyes carried a message clear enough for him to feel. This is only the beginning. Ethan turned once more toward his father. Richard's eyes shone, pride radiating brighter than any words could capture. And Ethan realized this victory didn't belong to him alone. It belonged to the man who had given him everything. And in that moment, the weight of years of sacrifice transformed into triumph. The weeks that followed moved quickly. Ethan settled into his new role, pouring the same determination and loyalty into his work that had always carried in his life. And Isabella, true to her reputation, demanded excellence, precision, and dedication from him. But something was different. Every meeting, every passing conversation carried a weight that went beyond professionalism. Their eyes would meet just for a moment too long. Their words, though formal, carried an undercurrent of warmth, of unspoken recognition. It wasn't romance at first. It wasn't rushed or dramatic. It was quiet, natural, a bond that unfolded slowly, like pages of a story written in real time. After hours, when the office lights dimmed and the city glowed outside the tall windows, they found themselves lingering, talking not about numbers or strategies, but about life, about their fathers, about the regrets they carried, and the dreams they still held close. Ethan spoke of the nights his father went hungry so he could eat. Isabella shared how her father's absence left a hollow space she still hadn't learned to fill. And in those exchanges, they found comfort, they found healing. And Richard, always present, always steady, became part of that blossoming story. Isabella would visit him, listening to his gentle wisdom, laughing at his dry humor. She saw him echoes of her own father, and in some quiet, unspoken way, he filled a piece of the void she had carried for years. To outsiders, it might have looked unlikely. A young man and a powerful CEO. Two lives that should never have intertwined. And yet, something deeper held them together. Respect, empathy, a shared belief that family and love were worth more than ambition alone. One evening, as the sun set and painted the city in hues of gold, Ethan and Isabella walked Richard home together. Richard, leaning on his cane, looked between them with a knowing smile. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Sometimes, the heart recognizes what words cannot capture. What began as a job interview had transformed into something far greater, a career, a partnership, and slowly a love story. But at its core, it was always about family, about honoring the past while building something new, about remembering that even in the sharpest, most competitive corners of the world, compassion still had the power to change everything. And as Isabella and Ethan stood at Richard's doorway that evening, sharing a quiet laugh as the old man disappeared inside, there was no doubt in their minds. This was just the beginning of a future none of them had expected, but all of them needed. In the end, this story was never just about a job interview. It was about something far greater. It was about a son who refused to leave behind a man who had given him everything. It was about a father whose quiet sacrifices shaped a boy into a man of honor. And it was about a woman, a leader, who chose to look past appearances and resumes and instead to see the truth of a person's heart. Too often, the world tells us that strength is about standing alone, about climbing higher, faster, without looking back. But real strength, true strength, is found in remembering where you come from, in honoring the hands that lifted you, the voices that encouraged you, and the love that carried you through your darkest nights. Ethan walked into that building with more than a resume. He walked in carrying his father's legacy. And because he did, doors opened that ambition alone never could. Respect opened them. Loyalty opened them. Love opened them. And like Ethan Cole, you may just find that what you thought was the end of an interview is really only the beginning of something extraordinary. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to Heartfelt Tales TV for more powerful stories like this one. Until next time, this is Heartfelt Tales TV, where every story speaks to the soul.